All right, hey everybody, welcome back to Chapter 10. In this third video, we're going to be talking a lot about non-human speech. This is an area that I am really fascinated by. I don't feel like the textbook goes into enough detail about it, so I'm kind of supplementing that information here. So the question is whether or not language is specific to humans. And whenever I ask this in the classroom, usually I get lots of different kinds of answers from all different perspectives and all kind of different opinions and using different kinds of evidence and things like that. So I'm going to talk about this issue in this video. So there are three main categories in which people have identified differences in human language versus non-human language. And in fact, it's these three differences that cause a lot of researchers, the majority of researchers, to say that non-humans do not have language. That instead what they have is verbal communication. So we'll talk about what that distinction is in just a moment. So these three differences are basically going to be these three items here: semanticity and the arbitrariness of units, displacement in time and space, and discreteness and productivity. Those are the three ways in which humans and non-humans have different abilities to communicate. Humans can do all three of these things. We're going to see that non-humans struggle with them and that there's not very good evidence for them. All right, so the first here is going to be semanticity and the arbitrariness of units. Basically what this means is that the language that we use has some kind of meaning, and that meaning is arbitrary. So if, for example, if I were to ask you, what is this right here? What is this thing in my hand that I am holding? You would be able to tell me that is a mug, right? Is there anything mug-ish about this mug? Is there any... In other words, if we reset all languages across the world and we came across this again and had no memory of what it used to be called, do you think that we would arrive to the conclusion that this is supposed to be called a mug? No, because it's arbitrary. There's nothing about this mug that looks like a mug. That's very different than onomatopoeia, for example, where like we call a roar because it sounds like a roar, right? Or like an oink, or a bark. That those words are called what they're called because they kind of sound like those things. Or the word ow, right? It's called ow because it sounds like ow. Whereas that is the sound that we make whenever we are injured. Whereas, things like camera, headphones, computer, these are words that are arbitrary. They do not have any property about them that gives them that name. Instead, they have been assigned that name for only reasons that have to do with language itself and not of the physical properties of that object. I feel like I made that probably more complicated than it needed to be. But basically, there's nothing inherently cherry about a chair. You wouldn't look at a chair and think, you know what would be obviously that is called a chair. Otherwise, all societies would probably have the word chair for that chair. But it's not. So, okay. So that is something that non-humans do not have. That whenever a non-human barks or roars, there's no meaning behind that is arbitrary. You might have an animal call out in pain or in fear, but that sound represents fear. It doesn't represent a word that represents fear. So it's not the case that a dog would very calmly say woof, and that woof means I'm terrified, right? The woof just represents the woof, right? Okay, so anyways, basically animals don't have words in that same way. Non-human animals don't have different kinds of arbitrary words that convey meaning. The second piece here is going to be displacement of time and space. Basically what this means is that the language that we can use can refer to things both in the future and also across great distances. Non-human communication does not seem to have that. So it doesn't seem to be the case that your dog, for example, can tell you something that happened a long time ago, or something that happened that will happen in the future. Or, for example, if your dog is barking because you're opening up a can of food, it's not because your dog is excited for what it's going to get. Your dog is telling you, I want that now. I want it right now, right? They're not conveying a future prediction. The same is true for great distances. You're not going to have a dog that's trying to tell you about a squirrel a town away, right? If it can see that squirrel, if it can hear that squirrel, it'll be barking, but it's not going to be thinking about that squirrel and then tell you about it from there. So oftentimes when we have nonverbal communication, you might see something like an alert signal, like your dog's barking because the mailman is there. But that's generally going to be in the presence of another stimulus. It's generally not going to be the case across times or across distances. And finally, we're going to have discreteness and productivity. In this case, humans have the ability to create words. That these words are discrete units, which means that they are independent of one another. You can take these words and you can rearrange them to make all kinds of different meanings. So you could say something like, I am thirsty, but I could also say, you are thirsty. In that case, thirsty is going to be assigned to different people, right? And so we have the ability to take these words, rearrange them in all different ways to create different kinds of meanings. So for example, you could say like, jumping on the trampoline is a fun thing to do, right? Or you could say, a fun thing to do is jump on a trampoline. They both mean the same thing, but their sentences are different. We rearrange the words. And we can even take those words and throw in synonyms, right? To use different words to mean the same thing. And so our language can be recombined and transformed in an infinite number of ways because of these different words and what they mean and how we can substitute them with one another and rearrange them to create new meanings. So it does not seem to be the case that non-humans can do that, which is why researchers will say that humans are special and that humans have language and non-humans don't. All right, so I want to tell you about Nim Chimpsky. Nim Chimpsky is a very famous case in psychology. He has passed away since then. This was done, I think, in the 70s. Nim Chimpsky, they named him Nim Chimpsky because, obviously, after Noam Chomsky. And he is one of the earliest attempts at having a non-human acquire a new language. And they wanted to teach him American Sign Language. So they wanted to teach him how to use signs. So their vocal cords are very different from our vocal cords, so we couldn't rely on just, trying to teach him to speak, verbal communication like you'll see in the Planet of the Apes movies. So basically they relied on sign language. And try to teach him sign language there. And it's important, I think, to know that basically this was sponsored by Herb Terrace. Herb Terrace was a researcher who was, I think, B.F. Skinner's very final last student. So he was his student, and basically he wanted to prove Noam Chomsky wrong about language and wanted to show that if you raise a non-human organism like you would a human, that non-human can pick up on a language just like a human could. So essentially, the goal here is that they were going to take this baby chimp and they were going to raise this chimp to be a human. So you see him here wearing clothes. They'd give him breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They'd have him sitting in the little booster chair at the family table, giving him human food. That he would take baths and showers like a human would. That he'd have human toys. That basically, for as much as they could, they wanted to give him, the experience of growing up as a human. But this project was widely considered a failure. And it was considered a failure because basically by the time he became an adolescent, he became very unruly and started showing more quote-unquote chimpanzee-like behaviors. So that's one problem. The other problem is that there wasn't really a lot of good coordination or management of this project from the very beginning, that people, that he would, be left unattended, or that he swapped houses a lot, that his training wasn't always regular, and so that all these things created problems such that Nim Chimpsky was considered a failure of a project. It was just, even though it had, at the time, had lots and lots of press attention, ultimately people believed it to be a failure. There is a fantastic documentary about Nim Chimpsky that is heartbreaking, that is called Project Nim. You can find a trailer for it in this slideshow at the very end of the PowerPoint slides. You can find that there. I highly recommend that movie if you can find it. Sometimes it's streaming on Amazon or Netflix. I haven't looked at it recently to tell you where it's streaming. But if you get a chance, it's like 80 or 90 minutes. Very interesting, very good. So Nim Chimpsky did learn a few things that were communication. So, for example, if you presented with him with a banana, he would sign the phrase Nim, and he would sign the phrase banana. And so he would say something like banana, banana, Nim, Nim, banana, banana, Nim, Nim, banana, Nim, banana, Nim. But that is not language, right? That's just communication. Why? Well, it does seem like it might have some lexical properties, so it may have semantics, but it doesn't have syntax. It doesn't have the order necessary, the grammar necessary to really qualify as language. There have been some other kinds of examples of non-humans that might have acquired language. One of my very favorites is Kanzi. Kanzi is a bonobo, which, if you don't know, bonobos are usually widely considered probably the most intelligent species besides yours truly, besides humans. They are probably the smartest apes. They're fascinating creatures. They, for example, have different roles in their clans. Like they will have like security guards in their clans, where they have an enforcer who goes around and makes sure that no one is stealing, and if somebody is stealing, they will punish them and fight them, and that's like their job, it's their role. So very, very interesting group of animals. And Kanzi is referred to in the book, but does not use sign language. Instead, Kanzi is able to demonstrate some appreciation for language because Kanzi does react to syntax. Basically, Kanzi has a lexigram board. You can find it by clicking on the link that you'll see here in this PowerPoint. Basically, Kanzi has a big board of symbols that Kanzi can press to communicate different things about what Kanzi may want. If Kanzi wants a banana, he'll signal for the banana. If he wants a break, he'll signal for a break. If he wants to go outside, he'll signal for that, and things of that nature. But he seems to be able to follow syntax pretty well. Like if you're giving him orders and instructions, he can follow that really well. Again, you can find more about that if you click that link. And I highly recommend that you do, because this stuff is super interesting. You can also find an example of Alex the parrot, who is a parrot who seems to have some ability for non-human language. You can also find that in the very end of this PowerPoint too, those videos. So, some humans think that that psychologists are unique. Steve Pinker, who I talked a little bit about his work earlier in these videos, but you can find some of his lectures again at the end of this PowerPoint. I have a link for a video that he does about language and thought. He thinks that humans are unique in their ability to have language. Noam Chomsky thinks that. Ramachandran, who is the guy who really kind of popularized research in synesthesia in phantom limb syndrome, he thinks that humans are unique in this ability. And basically they all argue that our brains seem to have some kind of inherently genetically wired ability and susceptibility for language, that we pick it up very easily because of that. And so they argue that Coco the gorilla, that Kanzi the bonobo, that Nim the chimp are all kind of getting by using very complicated behavioral chains, so that they are basically acquiring this language using operant conditioning and classical conditioning, very much in the same way that John Watson would have argued this in the 50s and 40s. Or, well, actually for John Watson, that'd be more in the 30s. And so a lot of behaviorists kind of feel that way, much like these other researchers do too, which is, I guess, is in one way that Noam Chomsky, something he has in common with behaviorists. And so John Watson even himself didn't believe that humans had what we would consider language. Instead, what he considered language is essentially kind of covert speech, that your thoughts that you're thinking to yourself is just language. It's the same as any other thought. It's just unspoken language. All right, so we're going to move on from here to talk a lot about language acquisition, which is a big part of this chapter, and something that those of you that are interested in developmental psychology, some of this you might have heard before. So I'm excited to get into it with you. We'll talk soon. See you there. Bye.